This episode of The Partially Examined Life is brought to you by IDOU. IDOU has a whole suite of AI and design thinking programs that show you how to combine AI tools with human-centered design to boost creativity, speed up insights, and solve problems in new ways.
You're listening to The Partially Examined Life, episode 372, part 2. We've been discussing Kant's ethics lectures. We had sort of finished the first two sections, the first two lectures that we'd read on his introductory observations and the supreme principle of morality, his metaethics. And now we're going to get down to, we read several sections on duties to oneself, which he thinks are sort of the most important, the primary ones, and then duties towards others. And a lot of these follow. So even lying, right? The quintessential duty towards others is not really because of the harm it's going to cause other people. It's about what it does to you and your integrity and respecting humanity as an end in itself, which, you know, you're the humanity that you are most aware of, that you have the most immediate control over and contact with. So yes, a lot of these things sort of actually fall out of our duties towards ourselves. In fact, some of the other, like charity, we were saying he doesn't emphasize positive virtues, that it's all about prescriptions. And some of what you would consider positive virtues above and beyond, like charity, are actually like, well, nature distributes things unequally, and that's kind of not fair. So when we give to charity, when we give to somebody that's in need, we're just making up for that natural. So it's actually just our duty. It's not above and beyond. Like, we owe those people. We owe the poor an equal share. Like, so
nature, like social arrangements, society is unjust. It sounded very, almost communist, yes. Social warrior type stuff. Like, society is structured to marginalize certain groups or to be unjust, and they have a right to be compensated for that. It's not just charity. Pretty unexpected idea from Kant there.
Yep. He even has a section in this whole thing about, like, how judgy can you be about other people? Because clearly he wants to judge other people quite a lot, but he recognizes, like, well, you only really know your own breast. And so you should be really disciplined and strict with yourself because you actually are in a position to do that, whereas you're not in a position to do that with other people. But yeah, and like, when is it okay? Like, he gets down to manners. When is it okay? Like, is it part of friendship to tell your friends their flaws? Like, well, no. We need to just kind of
like yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of
there's a lot of nuance. Yep.
But to begin with, here he starts off this duties to oneself section by saying, usually these are subordinated towards duties to others, and they're explained in terms of happiness, right? You know, my duties to myself are kind of about what make me happy, but he's going to say no. They actually take first place because we can't obligate ourselves if we degrade our own persons. And we're going to describe these in terms of obligation just as much as duties to others. It's not just consequentialist, like if you're a drunkard, it's bad for you, it's unhealthy or whatever. It's actually, no, it dishonors your own person is the idea. So it's not what's good for you necessarily. It's about what dishonors you or shows disrespect for yourself.
And all of that is through the lens, ultimately, of rightly using your freedom. Then that goes back to the categorical imperative about whether or not the rules that you set for the regulation of your inclinations can be universalized.
And you'd think that, with all this emphasis on avoiding dishonor, that it would be, well, death before dishonor. And he does say that, like, in terms of, if you're a soldier and you're being commanded to go into war, like, don't let your niggling fear of death, get in the way of your duty. But it doesn't go so far as, like, the Stoics on suicide. Like, if this is an intolerable situation for you, you should just kill yourself. Like, no, it's actually you, because that is the fundamental thing. So we had a whole section on suicide as the primary duty. Like, if you don't stay alive, you can't do any of these other things. So it's certainly not like degrading, using your freedom to eliminate the possibility of freedom altogether, to eliminate your corporeal self. That is off the table. Even if, you would suffer dishonor, you'd be put in chains, whatever, the kind of things that.
What if everyone killed themselves? But no, he's very into the whole self-contradiction idea, right? Yes. Using my freedom to eliminate freedom. Because again, the will to be, to actually truly will something in the autonomous sense can't be self-contradictory. That idea is at work throughout this. I don't think he's correct, even by the lights of his own theory here. I don't think this works as an argument, just because maybe I'm wrong about that. I have to think about it more. But my feeling was it doesn't quite work in the way that the whole lying example works, where I universalize and then I imagine a world in which everyone is lying, and therefore I undermine the possibility of lying. If I universalize suicide, I don't really undermine it. Anyway.
Yeah, and he seemed to be also, I agree with Mark, your summary about him being categorically against suicide, though like his example of Cato, he does seem to allow it from the standpoint of the exception that proves the rule. It seemed to be like there were cases where you could choose, akin to the way in which your honor would require you to sacrifice your life in battle, your honor would require to sacrifice your life. Not certainly in terms of intolerable, anything that's just sort of dealing with the trials and tribulations of life, that would be not universalizable. But the notion that you could have so dishonored yourself or be so dishonored, or also that you would be in such dire straits that physically that it wasn't, as I'm just uncomfortable. It did seem to be like that was.
Yeah, you can't do it from prudence, right?
You can't do it from prudence. No, that's right.
So it would be convenient in many cases. It would be, it would be convenient to kill yourself. But I think you're on to this distinction, Dylan, where he says, this is not to say that suicide is cowardly. It can be done courageously. It can be done from honor. But Kant says, that's just the psychology of it. My problem is not that it's cowardly or dishonorable. It's that it's unfree. You're letting your freedom be limited by an externality, which is your misfortune. So Cato should have let Caesar torture him. Lucretia should have fought to the death. You're allowed to fight to the death. So suicide by cop, maybe allowable. But you're not allowed to, just take your own life for
you cannot allow to let yourself be raped, but you should not kill yourself because you're about to be raped, but you could die fighting the rapist. That was a main thing, along with his arguments against various sexual activities.
The Lucretia example. She ought to have fought to death in defense of her honor and her modesty.
Seth, were you?
So just that he actually gives, in addition to the Lucretia and the Cato example, it's like there are many examples where it seems justified. And he's saying it's not that those examples are justified. It's that they're psychologically understandable why people would make that choice, but they're not morally defensible. And prior to the discussion of suicide, he says, look, you're not permitted to sell your limbs for money. And this is what I thought. I really like this part where he says, your body is your instrument of action on earth in this life. And morality is about action. So harming, damaging, or destroying the vehicle, your vehicle for acting morally, for basically functioning as a human being, is not permitted. He's like, if we could switch bodies, then sure. If we had a spirit that we could just inhabit other bodies, then we could maybe make the excuse that you could do something to a body and then switch to a new body. But he's like, this is what you have and this is what you got. And damaging it, destroying it, selling off parts of it is not permitted. So if you buy into that logic, or even just assuming that, then the notion of why suicide is morally indefensible makes a lot more sense, because it's essentially the destruction of your instrument of moral acting. So it's almost like self-contradictory in some respect. But yeah, he's very sympathetic to why people do it. And this, I think, would be one of those where you start to push the limits of, can't be right. If you're talking about something, let's say assisted suicide, because you're dying of cancer and you're in a tremendous amount of pain. And I say, well, it's morally indefensible for you to commit suicide, but I totally get it. Go ahead. And you're like, well, this body that is my instrument for moral action on this earth has failed me. I can't use it for moral action anymore. So what's the point? I don't know. That's maybe a intro to philosophy course kind of discussion to have. But
Or you would obviously go down the road there of I'm using my body as the instrument of moral action against my own body, which he considers self-contradictory, but you're coming up with an example that doesn't seem so self-contradictory because you've changed the conditions, because you no longer, it's pretty easy to see that in the face of a complete lack of freedom regarding your demise, that your final act of freedom would be the act of suicide in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
This whole he does a lot of work with using our responsibilities and duties towards our bodies and the kinds of parsing out of the ways in which we can use it morally or not morally. And so we can't sell parts of our body. And he gives an example of a limb, but you immediately wonder like where the edges are here, right? Can we not sell our hair? Right? Is it immoral for us to sell our hair in order to buy our husband a watch? Or is it so clear that work isn't selling ourselves?
Well, he brings up that example.
He does bring up the example. And so, but he focuses on notions of like, that are sort of typical, like, well, I'm going to prostitute my body. I'm going to sell my body for the sexual pleasure of another. And so where is the line between that and other kinds of degradation of work? And why is it just that things like sexual penetration versus other kinds of degrading physical labor?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, he does say earlier on in 124, he gives a more ordinary example of where, I mean, doesn't give an example, but he says, it is utterly absurd that a rational being who is an end whereto every means exists should use himself as a means, right?
Yes.
Very familiar Kantian idea. A person can indeed serve as a means for others. So remember, this is something people often get wrong about Kant. It's not that we can't use each other as a means. We do that when we have coffee and get pleasure in each other's company. We're using each other as means all the time. It's just that we can't use others merely as a means. We also have to do it in a way which is consistent with their personhood, which means observing their rights. So he says a person can indeed serve as a means for others by his work, for example, but in such a way that he does not cease to exist as a person and an end. So you have a groundwork there for saying some forms of labor violate rights. Some forms of labor are degrading, as you pointed out, Dylan. And then, they fail the test.
Yeah.
So, on that page 124, a man can indeed dispose over his condition, but not over his person. Earlier, he's able to dispose of over everything pertaining to his person, but not over the person itself. So it might be a little arbitrary, but I think we make of it is, yes, the fingernails and the hair are different than your finger. Like one is a living part of you.
It depends if the roots of the hair go all the way down into your person. Where do they stop?
Yes. Okay. So you can't scalp yourself.
There you go.
And give your scalp to someone else. But you could cut your hair and give your hair to someone else. That's fine. But it does get to, right? Isn't it Locke? And then all these libertarians and things follow him that are like, the private property is rooted in the idea of I own my body. I can do whatever I like with my body. It's about consent. And Kant just fundamentally disagrees with that. You do not own your body. If there's justification for property, it has to be something else because your body is not your property. In fact, it is more like God owns your body. He brings in these religious things explicitly, not because he's saying, oh, just defer to religious authorities or something like this, but that these religious ideas express the fundamental facts of the matter, that it is as if we have borrowed our bodies. This is another thing that made me feel like he was very stoic, that like, we're not the owners of this life. We just are granted something for a temporary time and then fate will claim it back. Very early on, we said that the only evils for Kant, the only real evils are the evils that other people choose to do, which seems like, well, a lot of the things like disease and things, but he's like, no, those are not evils. Those are just part of life. So your body could be taken back from you at any point by illness. That's not your business. But it is, you can't be betraying that sacred trust that you've been given this body to use by cutting off pieces of it or selling it, renting it out.
I agree with you about the way in which he doesn't use words like sacred trust though, right? I mean, unless we say that his he is just dressing up conventional Christian morality with notions of a argument of contradiction with reason. I mean, I take him at face value as saying, oh, the reason that you are a steward of your body has to do with a contradiction that comes up with respect to the notion that you are at free will to dispose of your body.
He does use the word sacred, but it comes up later, page 178.
Okay.
There's nothing more sacred than the rights of others. But yeah, you're right, Dylan. He doesn't use that word in this section.
Well, so 149, suicide is rebellion against God.
Yeah. I mean, you're right, Mark. I was back and forth on this whole question about whether it's imbued with Christianity and as a context of his time, or is he basically taking a Christian position and acting as an apologist from the standpoint of reason?
I think the latter, but I mean, to be fair to him, in this text, you could just cut out the sections where he talks about God. There's nothing that hangs in his argument. He's just trying to show, right, because that whole thing, it's a rebellion against God because God put us on earth here for a reason. And if you commit suicide, you're basically just flouting God's, you're giving him the middle finger or whatever. So, but he doesn't need that to bolster his argument.
He does argue against command theory. So it's not wrong because God says it's wrong. God says it's wrong because it's wrong. Morality comes first. Although he does say a very Korsgaardian thing where he acknowledges that we do need an enforcer, right? It sounds almost like the Korsgaard's compromise between Kant and Hume and Hobbes. There's a little Hobbesian element where he says, at a certain level, right, the enforcer, the sovereign, doesn't determine the content of morality, what's good or bad, but we need some sort of authority. It'll turn out to be the will in the end. But the other thing before we leave this section on duties to oneself, this introductory section, and go into the more detail in the other sections, I just wanted to point to this thing that I had said before about the basis in honor. So on page 127, so he'll say that this is towards the bottom, the principium of the self-regarding duties does not consist in self-favor, but in self-esteem. Our actions, that is, must be in keeping with the worth of humanity. We have two foundations for our actions: inclinations, which are animal in nature, and humanity, to which our human inclinations have to be subordinated. And then a little farther down, he'll say, all such duties are founded on a certain love of honor, consisting in the fact that a man values himself, and in his own eyes is not unworthy that his action should be in keeping with humanity. I thought that was very important. And this, again, Hume says something very similar, a little throwaway line about pride. And I just can't help but think he's expanding on this, and that his whole self-respect formulation, his whole end, you respect people as ends in themselves, that's kind of built off of that little nugget in Hume, I think, and this idea of honor and respect. So it's really interesting because it's not inclination based in the typical way we would think in terms of more obviously sentimental things like sympathy or interest in well-being, or as Freud would call it, libido or love. It's not about love. That's why I use that introduction. It's about honor and respect.
So there's some subtlety in terms of what constitutes a suicide? Is just being drinking too much, living an unhealthy lifestyle. You're committing suicide in slow motion. He wants to say, well, no, it's not to be praised, but it's not suicide.
Yeah, he certainly doesn't like drinking.
Because you undermine your ability to act freely.
So then we've been hedging here toward, Dylan was saying, what's special about penetration? Is that I would think putting your body in a coal mine and breathing in all those horrible fumes and things, that seems to be just as bad as sexual acts. And maybe he didn't consider air pollution and things maybe he should have. This is something we could use to improve his theory specifically, but certainly not just it's something that really debases you reputationally, right? Just flashing yourself. I'm going to just be a stripper. Nobody's going to touch me. There's no penetration involved, but that still is not okay for him. Yeah. So this duty is toward the body with respect to the sexual impulse. And I think we've said quite a bit about this, that, at least the sexual act itself inevitably involves giving your whole self to somebody. And so that there's something contradictory if you're just trying to do that, if you're having casual sex, or if you're doing any sexual activity that does not recognize the fact of what sex reveals and connects about yourself, right? Basically, if you're not using it the way it was meant to be used, then that's terrible. You're not killing yourself. It's bad in the same way as killing yourself.
This is certainly the place where you could most directly accuse him of the Christian apologetics.
I was going to say, before we slag him off about sexuality, just want to say he starts the section with a very interesting psychological observation. He calls the sexual impulse a quote-unquote sixth sense, or kind of sixth sense. And I thought, yeah, that's a really interesting observation, because it is really weird to desire, you could say desire the body of another person, desire the flesh of another person. I think years ago I said there's something cannibalistic about the sexual impulse, and I don't think you guys like that. It's a very Freudian idea, but it is really odd when you think about it, because it isn't fully physical, right? Unless you're a necrophiliac. And even then, I think you're doing something interesting in fantasy. It is in a way about the psyche of the other, but if it's purely lust, it's very focused on the body, and it's not just about touch, right? It's not just about what animals can do. Oh, this is physically pleasurable. I'm touching a body. I have a certain erogenous zones. There's an interesting psychology to it where we're getting into the head of the other person, but it's this weird mix of the sensual and then something else that makes it hard to categorize. This weird way in which we can make other human beings the objects of our appetites, which on another level are directed towards inanimate things like food, for instance, things that we take into our body. So in that sense, there is a very, he uses, does he say objectify? Or he doesn't use the word objectify, but he says essentially we're turning each other into things and objects. And so we're inherently ashamed of even having the impulse. We're just, because of this objectifying quality to it, because we get so focused on the body, sometimes at the expense of the personhood of the other. I thought that was, pretty psychologically acute.
And that you could do that to yourself, that we don't normally think like masturbation involves objectifying yourself. But yeah, it makes yourself into making, like, look, I'm a pleasure generating machine. I can pull the cranks, so to speak, and rack up more pleasure points. Yeah, that is making yourself into a thing.
Self-abuse, as they say.
And there's just nothing worse than homosexuality. It's the worst possible thing. It's worse than murder. Like, oh my God.
Let's take a moment to talk about our sponsors for today's episode, beginning with IDOU. Feel like you're falling behind on AI? Worried your organization is pulling ahead without you? Boost your impact and drive your team forward with IDOU's online learning experiences, including their new AI and design thinking programs. You'll master machine learning with IDOU's signature human-centered approach. IDOU's AI and design thinking programs are designed for leaders like you, people who want to stay ahead, but keep problem-solving human-centered. It's practical, hands-on, and built for real-world impact. IDOU has a whole suite of AI and design thinking programs that show you how to combine AI tools with human-centered design to boost creativity, speed up insights, and solve problems in new ways. At IDOU, you'll learn to apply human-centered methods to real-world challenges and turn insights into creative solutions that actually make a difference. Get practical, repeatable frameworks from IDOU to help your team innovate with confidence and stay ready for what's next. IDOU's courses are designed to seamlessly transition from theory to practice, ensuring that you can apply new skills right away and spark immediate progress. Class starts soon, so enroll today. For a limited time, IDOU is offering our listeners 15% off site-wide. Go to IDOU.com/PEL. That's IDEOU.com/PEL for 15% off. IDEOU.com/PEL.
We chose Function because it's the only health platform that gives you access to the kind of data most people never see and the insights to actually take action. Inside Function, you can test over 160 biomarkers from heart and hormones to toxins, inflammation, and stress. You can also access multi-region MRI and CT scans, all tracked in one secure place over time. It's an enhanced view of what's happening in your body. Fall is coming, so you're going to have new routines. The weather will shift. There's going to be a heightened focus on immune health. And it's not enough to just get yourself some vitamins and hand sanitizer. Real preparation starts inside your body long before the first cough or cold. See what your immune system needs. Fill the gaps early. Function is going to help you check relevant biomarkers like vitamin D, vitamin E, zinc, ferritin, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. So like cortisol, it'll tell you whether stress can be dragging your immunity down. Your white blood cell count is going to measure your body's defense against infections. Routine physical can skip this data, so you're left guessing why you feel depleted, why colds linger, or why you're struggling to bounce back after summer festivities. But you don't have to guess. Function includes over 160 lab tests, so you can better see what's happening under the surface and actually take action. This season, think better than quick fixes. Focus on the real checklist, the nutrients, immune markers, inflammation, and stress levels that will shape how you feel in the months ahead. Function has been good enough to give us access to these tests. We're still in the process of getting data collected, getting tests run, but it's all very illuminating. Just learning about this stuff, we are looking forward to learning more about ourselves and taking control. Learn more and join using our link, www.functionhealth.com/PEL. That's functionhealth.com/PEL.
That point, Wes, about that he says, just we're ashamed. There's just shame immediately associated with the desire, with the sexual desire. He actually says other interesting things, right? About not just about that sixth sense. He says something to the effect of, it's the only possible way of enjoying human beings that has the potential to not be treating them as a means. It's a very strange thing. But he says, we have this inclination and we're ashamed of it. But we have it, so we have to explain it, and we have to find a way that it can be done morally, right? And, to go back to what he says later, well, why are we ashamed of it? Because we're not inherently ashamed. You aren't born ashamed of sexual appetite. It's habitus, right? So if we were having the conversation, I might question him as to where that shame comes from. But he talks about it as if it's just, well, this is just natural. This is as natural as anything, that we're just ashamed of having this inclination.
Yeah, I think he thinks we're naturally ashamed just because we are in touch with the objectifying quality of it. And this is like Genesis, right? You don't know that you're naked until you eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then suddenly Adam and Eve are like, holy shit, we're naked. I think that really is about objectification, about our capacity to see other human bodies as objects of desire. It's really weird when you think about it, and leads to uncomfortable feelings.
Well, and in that way, he's denying erotic love as a form of love properly. So at 155, he says, love as human affection is the love that wishes well, is amicably disposed, promotes the happiness of others, and rejoices in it. So it seems pretty straightforwardly a kind of agapic love, right? And 156, this is sort of where I think you were, Seth. Since the sexual impulse is not an inclination that one human has for another qua human, but an inclination for their sex, it is therefore a principium of the debasement of humanity, a source for the preference of one sex over the other and the dishonoring of that sex by satisfying the inclination. The desire of a man for a woman is not directed to her as a human being. On the contrary, the woman's humanity is of no concern to him, and the only object of his desire is her sex.
He will say, just to be clear, you can combine sex and love in the context of a marriage. Later on, we'll learn.
Yes.
You can, if you set things up so that you preserve the personhood of the person, you can have a ethical sexual relationship with them.
Right. We were saying this at the very beginning of the part one. When you married, you give yourself wholly to the person that you receive, but because they then reciprocate, then you receive yourself back. So this sounds very Hegelian. Like this is a primary way of getting that you don't lose anything. Whereas if something is
reciprocity.
Yes. So the reason that incest between a parent and child is prohibited is because parents and children are just not inherently equals. And so there can't be true reciprocity. That's the main reason that we should.
I knew you were going to love this, Mark. Yeah.
So this is where, he's making the claim here that sex has this kind of like, so you have to establish a condition where you can give yourself wholly to the other, meaning you have to be in a relationship with somebody where you are fully recognizing them as an end in order to morally have a sexual relationship with them. But in no other sphere of human existence is that the case. I don't have to establish a relationship with the barista at Starbucks to treat them fully as an end in order for them to make me a coconut milk cappuccino grande.
You want coffee from me? We don't even know each other.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems like, well, there are many other things where the human body is involved. I mean, yes, it has to do with use of the body, but there's plenty of other things. I hire people to move stuff from one house to another, and so this feels prudish to me more than a little. But I get what he's saying. I just don't necessarily agree with it.
If you order your cappuccino with breast milk, then you do have to. That crosses a certain line.
Gross.
I can see that. Hey, man, breast milk's good for you. Nature's perfect food.
I forgot you're living in Austin.
Not Boulder, Austin.
Do we want to talk about, as we run out of time, duties towards others?
Just to touch on this, so there's this crimina carnis section, just because that's a weird, his prudish way of talking about these taboo sexual things is to use Latin for them.
Yes. It's like whispering cancer. Instead of using
Too
Latin.
delicate to say in German. Have you ever looked at the diary of Samuel Pepys?
No.
The English guy from the 1600s. He's like, it's a very detailed diary of, what he does during the day, including like, I woke up and I farted and it was really good. But he'll talk about like getting licentious with his maids. So anything time he goes sexual, he starts doing it. Is it Latin or French? I forget which, but yeah, he has to switch into a different language. You need a romance language. You can't do German or English if you're going to talk about it.
So just that these, so they're crimen carnis contra natura or in line with natura. So like even adultery or incest, well, those are, at least go along with instinct, that it is doing something that could potentially produce a child. So it sounds very teleological in the sort of objectionable sense. Like this is what sex is for, making children. That's what it's for. If you're doing anything that could not result in that, then you are violating what it is for. And so then he just runs through the, onanism, sexus homogenei, and then the intercourse with animals, which I did not write if he had a Latin term for that. He concludes that with suicide is certainly the most dreadful thing that a man can do to himself, but is not so base and ignoble as these crimina carnis contra naturam, which are the most contemptible acts a man can commit. So there you go.
Yeah, and he ends with, how do we educate the youth about this? Because if you talk about it, right, you might turn them on to it. So what do? We just keep silent about it? That's pretty much the method.
It's like those anti-drug films and stuff that get kids intrigued about trying drugs. It's that if you're too best to, minimize. But he just recognizes these are so common, and it's just, this really bogs him. Hopefully not the animal thing. I don't know what was going on in his time period. Yes. Okay. So of duties towards other people, which we've said a lot about, he doesn't say perfect and imperfect duties, but he says two duties of goodwill or benevolence and duties of indebtedness or rectitude. So the latter are the perfect duties. They are required of us. The first one are kindly. Then there's quite a bit of discussion about, can you command somebody to, love thy neighbor or something like that? Like, well, no, love is well-wishing from inclination. Inclination is not very reliable. You could just not like somebody and then you don't do your duty by them. The kind of love that is just commanded, be polite, be considerate, help people out in their rightful pursuits. Those are things that we owe toward everybody. And that is the kind of love. We can't command our inclinations, but we can command.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot be obligated to do things that our will has no control over, and our will can't control our feelings. And this is, this is a very important point, because I think some people at least tacitly treat ethics as it is more about love and more about how we're comported to people in the domain of sentiment, which he's all for, right? He thinks ultimately obligation will habituate our sentiments. That's very important. And it's better to have our sentiments habituated. But we can't rely on that as a kernel, right? So if we observe the rights of someone who's a criminal, give them due process, we don't give them cruel and unusual punishment, not because we think that they're a nice person and that they arouse our sympathy, but just that's what we owe to their humanity.
Yep. You can judge people's actions, but you should always try to see the humanity in people. This is a surprisingly sort of, well, again, it's not non-judgmental, but it's adding some nuance. Hate the sin, not the sinner, kind of that thing. But I just liked we talked about where he uses the word sacred, and this is the only place on page 178. There's nothing in all the world so sacred as the rights of others. They are impregnable and inviolable. Woe unto him who infringes those rights and tramples them underfoot. Whoa.
Exclamation point.
Yes.
Yeah, it's interesting though.
We have a divine ruler, and his sacred gift to us is the rights of man.
Yeah, that's that literary use of God there. Like,
Yep.
You don't need, it's not we're doing it because God, but like they certainly go together. The religious point of view and the ethical point of view. They can be used to give you that motivation that mere recognition of the rights might not give you.
He brings up at one point this hypothetical of what if we lived in a world where we had unlimited benevolence for each other. We wouldn't need to respect the right. It would never occur to us that people have rights because we wouldn't have any inclination to violate them. He says it's a bad thing, actually. It's kind of a perfect utopian world, but we would lose something by not being aware of the rights of others and the respect that we ought to have for them. So benevolence shouldn't be flattered, he says. And then the other aspect, as we pointed out here, I'm on page 180, and doing well out of obligation habituates us to do it from inclination. And then here he kind of redefines love into two subtypes, right? We can like another person's quality, and then we can wish them well.
Yes.
And we can have universal benevolence in a sense. So it's not that we like people, but we can, in a way, like their humanity.
By well-wishing. We can wish the best for them, even for the worst person, right? That's what...
Yeah. So you can say, love thy neighbor, but it doesn't mean, I'm going to really like this person, even though they're an ass. It just means I'm going to wish them well, and I'm going to wish them to be worthy. I'm going to say they should be happy. I hope they're happy, and I hope they're worthy of being happy. So part of the sentiment is about their moral reform. And even someone who's a king who's putting someone to death for a crime should be able to make this distinction, and just don't make it personal. This is business.
Yeah. That was the part that sort of verged on a kind of, for basically smiling while you beat somebody. It hurts me more than it hurts you. And also so that's a negative aversion in this line, but it's sending somebody to the gallows and then say, well, I just really wish you the best. There's something
horrifying, certainly.
Yes.
in that idea.
I wish you were worthy of not being killed right now. And I wish you, all the best in heaven or hell, wherever you're going, purgatory.
I hope this
all the best
balances the scales. Like, you're going to undergo this punishment, but then maybe after, if it's up to God, what happens to you after that?
It's self-righteousness. This is where it's not all that way, right? I mean, there's something really, I think right about the notion of benevolence towards your neighbors is being much more possible in the notion of well-wishing as opposed to genuinely liking them. I think that's true. And I think that there is something very civilizing about the notion of being able to get over, you don't need to like everybody, but part of us getting along with one another is basically wishing the best for everybody. But there is something self-righteous really about the idea of a judge or a monarch passing such...
But I think it just comes down to saying, though, we ought to respect people's rights even when we're punishing them.
That's true.
And punishment is not about hatred. It's not personal. It doesn't deny the personhood of the other, such that, right, we don't torture them, we don't do these things that would violate the personhood of the other person. Obviously execution seems to do that, but the idea is that, I don't know how you justify punishment in Kantian terms, because we usually justify it in consequentialist terms, right? We don't want to do it, but society needs it. There wouldn't be any order. We need deterrence, blah, blah, blah. But we don't do it because there's something inherently moral about vengeance.
The flip side of that is, he says something to the effect of like, if somebody was just a totally objectionable human being, just a huge prick, but they always acted according to the moral law, there'd still be something redemptive in them. I feel like he's kind of devaluing, he's saying, like, kindness is great, but it's not really praiseworthy. It's not praiseworthy in the same way that acting morally according to duty and obligation is praiseworthy.
Yep, against your inclinations.
It's just inclination.
Yep.
And it's just practical, just subjective, pick your category of, whatever. And that just strikes me as somehow uncharitable, if not wrong, because I think this isn't even appealing to like Humean sentiment, but I think we do believe that, especially if you're going to buy the Christian line, if he's a Christian apologist or whatever, it's like, well, charity, chastity, charity, all those things are considered virtues. And I think you could make the case that an Aristotelian type approach to developing virtues would include things about generosity and compassion and kindness and things like that in many cases. And so, I don't know, it just seems a little harsh.
I do really like the part that Wes just emphasized is he's very strong on treating people humanely and respecting their humanity, even in the face of punishment that might be part of a well-ordered society. There's parts of it that feel like he would be in line with the notion of someone like even Foucault, where punishment for the sake of punishment has no business existing. You would have limitations of freedoms and maybe things like helping re-educate people, cultivate the change of their behavior so that they could be part of society. But the notion of having degrading conditions in a prison because those people deserve it, that's part of their punishment, and treating people inhumanely because they are serving time or been accused of a crime, that kind of thing, that he would be very, very, very much against that kind of effort.
Yes, here's a quote, page 181. Judges in punishing crime should not dishonor humanity. They must indeed penalize the evildoer, but not violate his humanity by demeaning punishments. For if another dishonors a man's humanity, the man himself sets no value on it. It is as if the evildoer had himself so demeaned his humanity that he's no longer worthy of being a man and must then be treated as a universal object of contempt. So there are lots of things that we do, these sexual things, but also, as he's going to say in the next section, just telling any kind of lie. Like, the primary way that we are social animals is we reveal our thoughts to each other. And if you lie, you are completely defeating the point of being a human being. So it's like a very profound thing. It's not just like so there are no white lies, there are no harmless lies. These all just undermine, they make you an object of contempt. So we want to keep people up. If they have degraded themselves in this way, we want to reform them if possible. We want to see the good in them. We want to elevate them. We don't want to reinforce the terrible things they've done to themselves by humiliating them through punishments.
It's funny, you just said, like, if you lie, it subverts the entire social order and destroys it. If you commit suicide, you're destroying the nature of humanity. If you sell your body, it's like, there's a lot of shit. This is a lot at stake for Kant, man. Everything counts. Every single little thing you do all the time counts. And like, if you walked around and you were just like, if I turn left here, am I willing? Is this a universal that can be adopted by everybody? Turns left here at this street, or should it? I mean, it's like, man, there's a lot at stake. It must have been exhausting.
Well,
to be
that's why it's not consequentialist. It's not consequentialist. You don't really think that you're going to destroy the world or whatever. It's not like, but it's as if you were saying, screw humanity. And like, we don't want to do that. Like, that's just the a priori thing about morality is We should all be on the up and up, and not even in our thoughts, not in any way trying to subvert that.
This is the whole free rider, sensible knave problem, right? Whenever we talk about, well, it's just me doing it. I'm not really destroying society because the rest of society isn't going to do it. I mean, it raises really big problems for these sorts of accounts. But yeah, Hume tried to address this in a way that I think we weren't fully satisfied with.
So amping up the rhetoric here might be the response to Hume, because like, you're not going to really be happy with yourself if you're the sensible knave, are you? That's kind of what Hume's solution is. And Kant is like, you are destroying your humanity if you
Exactly, yeah.
Well, I think this is a good point to end on. We certainly didn't get to all the sections. I'm hoping I can convince some of you to record a supporter-only part 3 for us to just report on some of the other things we read on truthfulness. There's really interesting stuff.
Friendship.
For instance, friendship. Yeah. Compare what he has to say to Aristotle. I'm sure there's a lot we could say about that. And how cold-blooded is he? Is he a good friend? Is Kant a good friend? It's nuanced. He's not the ideal friend. Let's put it that way. He's not the kind of friend that I want. Yeah. You should not reveal too much of your soul to other people, because that would burden them. That's kind of dickish.
I think it's really, there's a lot of fascinating stuff in there, right? It almost sounds like Nietzsche. Untruth is a condition of sociality, right? There's truthfulness grounds our social cooperative nature, but also we need a certain amount of untruth. We can't just go around exposing everything about ourselves, all of our feelings. We drive each other crazy.
Yeah, just don't call it untruth, call it non-disclosure.
Yes. Yes. Although I do think he thinks we can lie in certain circumstances. You know, if someone is putting a gun to our head and saying, tell me where my next victim is. Yeah, we can lie.
Well, after Michael Walzer's Just and Unjust Wars, if you want to learn about just war theory, very politically timely. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you reach out to us, PEL@partiallyexaminedlife.com. The blog post associated with this episode, you could make comments on. You could support us, of course, through Patreon or through Apple or other ways. And there are usually channels for communicating with us that way. And we've got a Twitter feed, of course. We've got our Facebook group. Lots of ways to connect. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.